So what are the strongest and weakest of the Leman Russ battle tanks around? Let's talk damage output, powerful abilities and defense, and which vehicles I feel like we're going to see most likely carrying the Imperial Guard battle line going forward. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Astra Militarum, and in this video I thought I'd do an update to one I made back in 9th edition, talking through the effect and damage output of each of the Leman Russ variants around, and how they stack up against each other in terms of damage and defense. In 10th edition, it really did feel like a power come down for the Leman Russ. Vehicles in general got a lot tougher and a lot more resilient to small arms, but Leman Russes kind of got the short end of the stick, just very overcosted compared with a lot of other faction tanks, having price tags around about 180 to 200 points for the most part. Definitely not very encouraging that they were kind of rarely played in an army that wasn't doing particularly well compared with its peers in the first place. Recently though, they've had a whole bunch of points decreases, and are now feeling far more viable on the battle line of the Guard army once more. Most of them went down around about 20 points, a few a bit more than that. Currently in 10th edition, these are the points costs for the 8 variants of Leman Russ. We've got the Vanquisher at 155, the Demolisher and Eradicator at 160, the standard battle tank, Exterminator and Executioner all sat at 180, and the Demolisher and Tank Commander being the most pricey, the Demolisher at 200 and the Tank Commander at 205. In this video I thought we'd go through them each one by one, look at their damage output and put them on a chart relative against each other, and also talk through the special rule of each datasheet, which is a pretty big thing in addition to their main gun, and for some of them it's really quite a deciding factor. Starting out, let's talk about the standard Leman Russ battle tank, and then we'll work through the rest from cheapest to most expensive. The standard Russ is 180 points, and comes with a fairly meaty stat line at toughness 11, a 2+ save and 13 wounds. Definitely needs some dedicated anti-tank firepower to crack through that. As well as its main gun, it does get a decent amount of small arms, a heavy stubber on the top, and a hunter-killer missile. Likely a las cannon on the hull, I'd guess, for the most part. And then I feel like multiple things could work for the sponsons. I feel like the multi-melters are maybe the scariest out of them, though I think you could definitely make arguments for the big overwatch that you can get with heavy flamers, and the fairly dangerous and good AP of the plasma cannons, particularly against marines. For the standard battle tank though, you get the Leman Russ battle cannon, 48-inch range, d6+3 shots, or hitting at strength 10, AP 1 and damage 3. Kind of middling strength does mean that it's not going to be particularly great against hard targets, but it gets that profile augmented by a special rule which is a pretty helpful direct damage increase. Armoured Spearhead allows you to reroll hit rolls of 1, and if that enemy unit is on an objective, then you get to reroll all hit rolls instead. It's quite a powerful special rule. Even the base version of it is helpful, though I do find it maybe a little bit weird that the tank's damage output increases quite so much when you target enemy units on objectives as opposed to off them. Starting out with the big damage table, here we'll put the battle tank on it. Overall, as we'll see for the rest of them, pretty good damage output across most targets. It actually seems to be arguably one of the best against Terminator profiles now, wounding them on 2s and then just forcing a lot of saves, though admittedly if they do get a cover save then this will drop off quite a bit, as then they'll be saving on a 2+ again. This is also being slightly generous to the Leman Russ as well, is assuming that the target is on an objective marker, and I feel like while you can certainly prioritise things that are, it's not always going to be the case. It means that if you wanted the numbers that were not on an objective marker, you'd decrease these numbers to 75% of what they are. It still gets the reroll hit rolls of 1 though. Overall though, I definitely don't think it's a bad variant, and it's particularly vicious at clearing objectives, as you'd get to reroll the hits for all the other guns as well, not just the battle cannon. Next up we've got the Leman Russ Vanquisher, which is the cheapest at 155 points. This one has the Vanquisher cannon, a single shot at strength 18, AP 4 and damage d6+6, and it does have the heavy keyword, which means that you'll be hitting on a 3+ if you were stationary, even if you didn't have a tank order. It's really quite fun, though it is incredibly swingy, and it doesn't ignore invulnerable saves anymore. Quite a big deal if, say, you target something with a 4+ invulnerable save, your opponent's going to be really incentivized to re-roll the result if they fail the invulnerable, meaning that you basically give them quite a good opportunity to save a lot of damage. The Vanquisher's special rule is kind of on point though. Each time you make an attack with the Vanquisher cannon against a monster or vehicle, you get to re-roll the wound roll. It means that if you convert the hits, you're very likely to convert the wound, 8 out of 9 times or better. Still though, it's definitely a massive all or nothing gun, and its damage is going to be massively overkill against lighter targets. As a result, as you can expect, the main Vanquisher battle cannon is basically near useless against infantry if you're only ever killing one of them at max, and often not even then. It is however one of the best variants against tanks and vehicles, as you'd hope really. Turn on turn firing with a Vanquisher cannon averages around about 5 wounds against a Rhino, 2 or 3 against a Maleceptor, or 4 against a Land Raider, though obviously it's very much all or nothing. Either you'll get that wound through and get a huge d6 plus 6 result, or you'll get nothing at all. The numbers are good, but it's not quite as good as the other tank destroying variant that we'll get onto, though technically it could have victories against most of the armoured targets if it stayed stationary and the other tank didn't have a tank order. You'd improve the Vanquisher's numbers by plus 33%. Overall, I'd still say it's probably a bit unreliable, but not quite as bad as it was before. Now it is quite so cheap. I feel like at 155 points, it's a lot less of a handicap to bring one. At least you still get the rest of the Leman Russ profile and all the small arms and things. You will get those cheaper than any other tank here. Next up, for 160 points, there's the Leman Russ Punisher. This one gets the Punisher Gatling Cannon, 20 shots at 24-inch range, strength 6, AP 0 and damage 1, but it gets a damage increasing special rule called Mow Down the Enemy, giving you devastating wounds provided you're not firing against things like monsters or vehicles. That's definitely handy to have, as otherwise AP 0 would have been a bit sad even against moderately heavily armed infantry. Again, the Punisher's stats compared with the rest are kind of predictable, fairly solidly the best against the 1 wound infantry targets, the Termagants here, kind of okay against the Intercessors with their 3+ save, a bit underwhelming against Terminators and downright bad against anything heavy. Again, not unusable if you did need something specifically to destroy a lot of 1 wound infantry targets, though I feel like in general the Guard army maybe doesn't struggle for that quite as much as other factions. Lots of things like las guns and random heavy stubbers going around helps to chip in. Next up, we've got the Leman Russ Eradicator. The Nova Cannon on this one is strength 7, AP 1 and damage 2, a bit shorter range than the Battle Cannon, and it gets a few more shots on average with D3 plus 6 rather than D6 plus 3, so an average of 8 against most targets. You might get more hits against Blast. The Eradicator's got a couple of special tricks as well. It gets to ignore cover against its target, which is very relevant in 10th edition, and it also can fire with an engagement range against targets that are there and doesn't take the penalty to hit if you are locked up. These numbers are just the raw number, and don't assume that any opponents have cover whatsoever, so it is maybe kinda a little bit unfair to the Eradicator's main purpose. Even so though, it's a tank that's very specialised like the Punisher to just taking down the lighter targets. Fairly good against Termagants or Intercessors, pretty bad against literally anything else. It doesn't even catch up with the regular battle tank against Terminators, even if they have a 2+ cover save against its attacks. These numbers are all weighted per point as well to 180 points worth of units, and that is accounted for in the comparison. I feel like this one's still just a not very good feels good tank compared with the big damage 3 variants like the battle tank, the Exterminator or the Executioner. I feel like being slightly cheaper in points maybe just isn't quite enough to outweigh the fact that it just really struggles against 3 wound infantry or anything with a multi-wound profile like any of the vehicles. Next up, and the next price bracket up, is the Leman Russ Exterminator at 180 points. This one gets the Exterminator autocannon with rapid fire 4 and twin linked, so basically 4 shots out to 48 inches or 8 shots to 24, all at strength 9, AP 1 and damage 3, and re-rolling those wound rolls. The Exterminator special rule I think might be one of the single best out of any of these tanks, to be honest. Its Withering Hail means that after you've shot its gun, one enemy target that got hit by that autocannon will make all of the rest of your guard weapons an extra AP -1 better against that same unit, kind of basically feeling like it damages the armor of the enemy target for the shooting phase. So it's really quite a good one to kind of mark a target for the rest of your army, particularly if you're focusing fire with multiple units. Here's the damage output for the Exterminator at 24-inch range, and in general I do think that these numbers are pretty impressive. Admittedly, if it can't get within that range, it's going to drop these numbers by half, which is quite a big deal, though at least you get some damage output, unlike the Punisher or Demolisher. I feel like maybe it's a slightly situational limitation, kind of similar to the Leman Russ battle tank. The regular battle tank gets its big damage boost if the enemy's on objectives. This one gets its big damage boost if it can get them at least kind of close. Just in general though, it tends to be one of the top dogs against all targets. It's pretty much joint best against the Tyrannid Maleceptor on this list. That one has a 4+ invulnerable save. And if the regular battle tank is shooting Terminators that aren't on an objective, it slightly beats it out there, becoming the best Terminator Slayer. All round quite good I think though, both with these numbers and a bit of synergy with the rest of your shooting phase. Next up we've got the big plasma tank of the Leman Russ Executioner at 180 points. These things were absolute terrors in 9th edition, though a bit more in line with the rest in 10th I think. It gets its Executioner plasma cannon that, if overcharged, is strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3, with d6 plus 3 shots like the regular Russ. It is hazardous, so if you want to use that top profile, it does mean that you'll have a 1 in 6 chance of taking 3 mortal wounds. Over the course of the game, if it fires every turn, you could expect that to happen around about one time, so that is a bit of a downside. Its special rule, I'd say, is not terrible, but probably one of the weaker ones. It's one of those execution type special rules, which means that if you target something that's below half strength, you get to add +1 to hit. Very nice and helpful when it triggers, but for a lot of targets that you need to shoot at, it's just not going to be the case. For the Executioner's numbers, this one is supposed to be the best at killing things like Intercessors and Terminators. Heavily armoured Space Marines should be its prey, and it does seem that it's basically the joint best at killing those. For Intercessors, you kill around about 3 of them, so 6 wounds dealt. For Terminators, it's very similar to the Exterminator, and has the same thing where it's technically worse than the Leman Russ battle tank. Unless the Leman Russ battle tank happens to not be firing at a Terminator squad or an objective, in that case it's better. Otherwise, for the more medium vehicle targets, its mid-strength does mean it struggles against things like the Rhino or the Maliceptor, where its AP doesn't matter quite so much. It does come into its own a little bit more against Land Raiders and things though. Having a base AP 3 to fire at does improve it. Overall, it feels like perhaps a particularly interesting one if you've got Space Marines and Terminators very heavily in the meta. Next up, we've got the Leman Russ Demolisher for 200 points. It's the most expensive of the regular variants, and the Demolisher battle cannon does come with its signature short range, only 24 inches, but you get just as many shots as the standard battle cannon with D6+3, and they're much better in quality, strength 14, AP 3, and a big damage D6. Pretty threatening both against medium infantry and heavy vehicles. For its special rule, it gets the same one as the Eradicator, basically being able to shoot at units within engagement range, and also not suffer the penalty to hit rolls with the big guns never tire special rule. I feel that is actually pretty helpful for the Demolisher as it goes. Having a shorter range does mean that it's a lot more likely to wind up in combat, and your opponent's going to be a lot less secure in doing so if they know that you can just fire the Demolisher cannon at point blank range at them. Overall, despite its high points cost, and even when you waste it down to at the 180 point level, its numbers are all still really quite impressive. It still puts in very good work against the medium infantry like Intercessors and Terminators, but is the best against all categories against the Rhino tank, the Maliceptor and the Land Raider, even after you've waited for the points differences. Admittedly, it's not all that far ahead of the Vanquisher. I'd say it's not quite as swingy, but it still has its swings in its own way. Having to roll both a d6 on the shots and the damage definitely could leave you a bit flat-footed on either one, but overall it does look like it spits out the most impressive numbers. Finally, we've got the character Leman Russ in the Tank Commander. Pretty much the same stats as the rest of them, and you can pick up any one gun, but you don't get the special rule of the Russ that you're copying it off. And to some extent you may as well go for one of the pricier options out there, as you don't get any sort of discount if you go for, say, the Vanquisher variant compared with the Demolisher. They both cost the same here. As a result, the vast majority of people tend to go with the Demolisher cannon that I've seen. It is the one that I'd be most tempted to use myself, and then beyond that, for the extra 5 points that you pay over the Demolisher, you lose the special rule of shooting within engagement range, but you gain a tank order and it can be used within 12 inches, so good for supporting a different Leman Russ with a +1 to hit or similar. And it also gets a special rule called Death Befitting an Officer when it dies rolling a 2+, and if you do so, then you get to fire its gun one more time. Potentially a really quite serious amount of damage if it's spitting out a Demolisher cannon plus a bunch of multi-melters or something like that. You could seriously mess up an enemy unit that's got too close, ideally one that was just about to line up damage on one of your other tanks maybe. Previously it was just a bit too overcosted at 240 points, but now it's only 5 points more than the Demolisher. I think that these guys are very, very good now. I've seen plenty of people thinking of running Grand Strategist on them for an extra 15 points. That gives you an extra order, so you could have the Tank Commander Russ commanding 2 different Russes at the same time. He doesn't have the squadron keyword though, so can't issue orders to himself, so in general you probably want to pair him with another tank or a Rogue or Dawn or something. I don't think it's really worth changing things around too much compared with the Demolisher. The Tank Commander is basically going to have the same sort of damage output as the Demolisher normally, but just very slightly less efficient point for point, as is 205 rather than 200, but that doesn't make the biggest difference in the world at all. Overall, looking at the table, after these points updates, I feel like Games Workshop hasn't done too bad to try and make the majority of them fairly interesting within their own niches. I do feel like the Vanquisher, Punisher and Eradicator perhaps all have 2 big blind spots compared with the rest though. I think it might be okay if they were actually genuinely amazing at killing the target that they're dedicated towards, but they kind of only just about get there compared with other variants, having similar or only slightly superior damage output. Otherwise, the Battle Tank and the Exterminator are pretty great, provided you can actually target something that triggers their own damage boost. The Executioner is pretty amazing, but has a bit of a blind spot against medium vehicles. And the Demolisher is just all round strong, though is expensive and short-ranged. Just briefly talking about the flip side of things, I would bear in mind that with points cost changes, not only does it influence weapon damage output, but also durability per point as well. I would bear in mind for the cheaper versions of tanks, they do get advantages in more durability per cost, and also more efficiency out of all the rest of the guns that Leman Russes come with at stock, which you do get with just equally whether you pay for an expensive one or a cheap one. If we took the Demolisher to be a base, then it averages around about 3.3 last cannon hits to kill 100 points worth of the tank, and the Tank Commander will be close to that. The 180 point variants go up to about 3.6 last cannons, so around about an extra 11% more durability compared with the Demolisher. And then dropping down to the 160 point variants, it's more like 4.1 last cannon hits to kill 100 points, all the way up to 25% more durability than the Demolisher. As you decrease in points more, each further drop becomes even more impactful. Definitely is one advantage that if you go for the cheaper versions, the opponent will have to slog through more tanks worth of wounds for them to try and take off the board. And I feel like that maybe is something that a few people underestimate a little bit when comparing units. I thought it might be interesting to just pair all this theory hammer with a bit of a look at what actually gets played competitively though. And I just had a quick skim through around about 10 or so guard lists that had done kind of well in tournaments post the balance update, and there's definitely some trends as to what's getting played and what isn't. It seems that the most commonly played ones are the Tank Commander, Leman Russ Demolisher, and Exterminator, and also worth mentioning that the Rogel Dawn Battle Tank does seem to crop up about the same sort of frequency as these guys, though I certainly wouldn't say that it's dominant over the Leman Russ. The Tank Commanders are quite often run with Grand Strategist, and almost always with a Demolisher cannon. Demolishers are quite good if you've already got a Tank Commander and you want some that can actually receive orders, and the Exterminator tanks are often just played with just the one of them to access that special rule, as having the ability to get extra AP against one target can be kind of big. Out of the others, the standard battle tank and the Executioner seem to be at least fairly frequently played as well. They do have some pretty solid draws to them, with just the general purpose damage of the battle tank or the anti-space marine killing power of the Executioner. Though it does seem that there's just very little love for the cheapest Rosses currently. In these top lists I didn't see any Punishers or Vanquishers whatsoever, and only the one Eradicator. It seems that cheap wounds on the table just aren't enough of a draw to them. I guess this could always change as people experiment and adapt their armies. A bit of this might just be what people are used to running, but I must admit this was kind of where I was expecting the list to wind up. Tank Commander, Demolishers and Exterminators, and the cheapest Rosses maybe not quite being general purpose enough to get inclusions compared with other things. Let me know your thoughts though, and let me know which Rosses you think are doing best at the moment in 40k. What have you been including with your army to some success? Any niche uses that I've skimmed over here in the video? Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'm sure I'll have more for the Imperial Guard at some point in the future. Always fun to run some numbers and see what's working best. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel quite a bit, then any support on the channel's Patreon page, keeping these coming, is massively appreciated. Making all this content does take an awful lot of time and effort. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.